The de Havilland Sea Venom catapults its way into War Thunder, unlike that other guy. Let's check out what this thing can do. The original de Havilland Venom was designed in the immediate aftermath of World War II and first flew in 1949. The Sea Venom was a navalized version and didn't get airborne until 1951, as navalizing the aircraft for carrier use required some rather significant structural changes to the design, such as adding in the folding wing mechanism, accounting for an arrestor hook, and strengthening the landing gear. It was based on the NF-2 version of the Venom, and gave the Royal Navy a carrier-based fighter with a radar set. A few different versions were built, some of which incorporated upgraded engines, electronic warfare equipment, and even some versions produced for the French Navy where it was called the Aquilon. What we have in War Thunder is the Sea Venom FAW-20, which was the basic entry-level version of the plane. This aircraft saw combat service a number of times during its tenure with the Royal Navy, and also during its service with the French. Some of the most extensive use was during the Suez Crisis in 1956, while they were still relatively state-of-the-art, but during that conflict they ended up mostly being used in air-to-ground combat. In the Royal Navy, the Sea Venom was only a frontline fighter for less than a decade, and it was eventually replaced by the Sea Vixen out on the carriers. It still saw some shore-based duty and filled a reserve role up until the late 1960s. In French service, it was a frontline combat type until 1965, and it still flew with Australia until it was replaced by the A4 Skyhawk in the late 60s. The Sea Venom ended up being a relatively minor jet fighter in the larger history of military aviation, but it primarily served as an evolutionary step between propeller-driven fighters and more advanced transonic designs that were carrier-capable. Despite that, while it was in service, it was generally well-liked by its pilots and maintenance crews, and had a much lower accident rate than many other carrier-borne jets of the time. In War Thunder, the Sea Venom is at battle rating 7.7, right in the middle of the subsonic gunslinging fighter tiers. It carries the Mark 10 radar set, which is found on a few other aircraft from the era. This is a very basic search radar, but it has great dish angles, and it provides the C-scope in addition to the PPI. Also, you should note that the in-game stats for the radar are a little off. It absolutely can see out past 8.5 kilometers, and it's generally able to pick up a fighter-sized target around 10 or 11 kilometers. For weapons, the plane carries 4 20mm Hispano cannons with a 1-second burst mass of about 6.5 kilograms. You can choose from 6 different ammo belts, and you shouldn't have any trouble finding one that works for your playstyle. It's worth mentioning that the cannons are chin-mounted, and aren't especially accurate out past short range. Personally, I had a really hard time aiming these guns accurately, but the plane carries 600 rounds of ammunition, so sloppy aim wasn't really as much of a handicap with this jet as it would be in like a MiG-15 or something. Now, the flight performance of the Sea Venom is similar to other first-generation jet fighters in that it feels really underpowered while it's at slow speeds. The acceleration is pretty bad, and the climb performance isn't great either. Maneuverability in a dogfight is acceptable though, and the plane can retain energy well enough if you aren't too aggressive on the controls. The Sea Venom's rudder is a bit sloppy, it's tiny, but the aircraft is fairly well built, and I didn't rip my wings even once in this thing, even while pulling, into and out of high-speed dives. Overall, the performance is pretty average for an entry-level jet. Some good points, some low points, and if you've flown any of the other first-generation jet fighters, you'll pretty much know what to expect here. Flying the Sea Venom into missions is generally typical of subsonic gunslinger gameplay. There aren't any external weapons, so ground pounding potential is limited to softer targets, and you're basically going to be focused on air combat. I don't really see any role for this jet flying close air support. Having a radar set gives a little utility for finding targets at longer ranges, and as a fun bonus, this is a naval jet, and it actually fights in a BR range where you still get island maps with a carrier spawn every now and then. Meaning that sometimes you'll actually get to do takeoffs and landings from a carrier, which I think is crazy fun. Now, speaking of which, I need to take a minute and talk about the carrier stuff, since this is the first naval jet that I've covered that can actually spawn into missions with aircraft carriers. Don't AFK out on the takeoff. You'll want to make sure that you pull up a bit right after the catapult, or else you're going to find out if those swimming lessons stuck with you. The catapult takeoff gives a bit of a boost to your initial acceleration, obviously, but it's not a big advantage since the carriers tend to spawn out in the middle of nowhere. Landing on the carriers can be a little weird. So far, in most carrier matches I've had, when I needed to land, the carrier is way off in the middle of nowhere, very close to the edge of the map. So I wasn't really able to line up a correct approach more than 1 or 2 times. This means that most of the time I had to land pretty fast and at a steep angle, which isn't ideal. And also, the carrier tends to not show up on the mission map, so you have to just kind of remember where it was and find it visually. That's fine, just try to keep it in mind. Normal landings with the Sea Venom are pretty easy. It has good low-speed handling, and its landing gear is tough and short, which lends to some pretty forgiving performance on touchdown. You can drop gear at around 400 kilometers an hour, and landing flaps at around 300, but with the air brakes, it won't really take you long to close that speed gap. There's no chute or anything, since this is a naval jet, but overall, the landing performance is pretty easy. Now, the cockpit for the Sea Venom is a mixed bag. Visibility's okay, for the most part, but the crew are seated side by side, which can take some getting used to, as your radar operator sits next to you, operating the non-functional radar scopes. I didn't really care for the instrument placement, and overall, I'd have to rate this cockpit a tiny bit below average. To close out on the Sea Venom FAW-20. This jet has a healthy supply of ammo for its cannon, as well as a pretty good selection of ammo belts. It also has a radar set, which is uncommon at this BR, and it can do carrier stuff. However, doesn't have any external payload, its acceleration is pretty bad, and the chin-mounted guns can be a little awkward to aim properly. The final verdict on the Sea Venom is that this plane is a fun change of pace if you're mostly doing higher tier stuff, and if you're coming up from props, it can be a pretty soft introduction to jet gameplay. Actually getting to do carrier stuff in a jet is really fun, and I had a great time with this one. If you have it, but haven't flown it much, give it a shot. As always, thanks for watching.